Eleanor Mitchell's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she watched her husband's motionless figure grow smaller in the rearview mirror, abandoned among autumn leaves like discarded furniture. The man who had built their home with his own hands, who had carried their daughter on his shoulders through these same woods, was now just a shape on the ground, growing distant with each rotation of her tires. This wasn't how 47 years of marriage was supposed to end. Mike would search eventually. The nurses would ask questions. But by then, nature would have taken its course. A mercy, she told herself, as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. What Eleanor couldn't know was that salvation would arrive on 4 legs, with amber eyes and teeth sharp enough to end Warren's suffering, but wouldn't. How strange that the creature they most feared would show more humanity than she could bear to give. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Warren Mitchell had built his life the same way he'd built their log cabin, with patience, precision, and a profound respect for natural forces. At 72, his hands bore the scars of a man who'd worked with wood and wilderness his entire life. The cabin sat nestled against the Montana foothills, its wide porch facing east to catch the morning sun, where he and Eleanor had shared coffee nearly every day for 4 decades. Before the stroke 18 months ago, Warren had been the kind of man other men measured themselves against. 6'2", with shoulders squared by years of carrying lumber and tracking wildlife through Montana's backcountry. A Vietnam veteran who spoke little of the war but carried its lessons in his watchful gaze and deliberate movements. His career as a wildlife biologist specializing in wolf behavior had earned him respect in academic circles, though he preferred the company of trees and animals to university conferences. Eleanor had been his counterbalance, a registered nurse whose gentle hands had healed the community's sick and injured until she'd left her career to raise their daughter. Sarah had been their miracle after years of trying, arriving when they'd nearly given up hope. The 3 of them had been inseparable, a tight unit against the world's hardships. Until 7 years ago, when black ice on Route 12 had taken Sarah at 28, leaving a void no amount of Montana sunshine could fill. They'd weathered that storm together, though barely. Warren retreated into his research while Eleanor quilted obsessively, creating blankets for a grandchild who would never arrive. Somewhere in those grief-stricken years, they'd stopped reaching for each other across the bed at night. Then came the stroke. One morning, Warren simply collapsed beside the woodpile, his right side suddenly useless, words trapped in a mind still sharp but a mouth no longer obedient. The proud man who'd tracked wolves through blizzards now couldn't feed himself. The hands that had crafted furniture now couldn't button a shirt. The expert communicator now struggled to form the simplest sentences. The medical bills arrived with devastating regularity. Medicare covered only a fraction. Their savings dwindled, then vanished. The second mortgage came due. Collection agencies called daily. Eleanor began selling Warren's handcrafted furniture piece by precious piece. "You need professional care," the doctor had said at Warren's last appointment. "A facility with full-time staff." "We can't afford it," Eleanor had replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. Dark circles had become permanent features beneath her eyes, her once robust frame now gaunt from the physical demands of lifting a husband nearly twice her weight. Their closest neighbor, Mike Henderson, stopped by when he could, but at 65, with his own health concerns, there was only so much he could do. The nearest town was 30 miles away. The visiting nurse came just twice weekly. In the end, it wasn't hatred that drove Eleanor to her breaking point. It was love corroded by exhaustion, financial ruin, and the deafening silence of a healthcare system with no answers. The morning she loaded Warren into the SUV, telling him they were going for a drive, she believed she was being merciful. Warren knew better. But trapped in his uncooperative body, he couldn't find the words to save himself or her. The first hour after Eleanor drove away, Warren felt nothing but disbelief. Surely she would turn around. Surely this was some desperate ploy to attract attention from social services. 47 years of marriage couldn't end with him sprawled helplessly among fallen leaves, his right side lifeless, his voice reduced to unintelligible grunts. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the small clearing, disbelief gave way to a cold, numbing realization. She wasn't coming back. The woman who had promised to love him in sickness and in health had finally broken under the weight of that vow. Warren tried to roll onto his side, managing only to twist his neck enough to survey his surroundings. A small clearing bordered by ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. Not far from a hiking trail, he guessed, but far enough that casual hikers wouldn't stumble upon him. Eleanor had chosen the location carefully. Secluded yet natural, a place where a man's remains might not be discovered until spring. The November air carried the first bitter promise of winter. Not yet freezing, but the temperature would drop significantly after sunset. Warren had spent enough nights in these woods during his research to know what was coming. Without shelter, without movement, the cold would take him before morning. He focused on his left hand, still responsive, though trembling with effort and the beginnings of cold. His fingers clawed at the earth, trying to drag his body toward the nearest tree. 1 inch, 2 inches. The effort left him gasping, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. At this rate, he'd reach the tree sometime next week. As the sun dipped below the tree line, Warren's scientific mind calculated his odds with clinical detachment. Exposure would likely kill him within 8 to 12 hours. If not, dehydration would finish the job within 3 days. Predators might find him sooner. Mountain lions occasionally prowled these woods, though they generally avoided humans. Wolves, too. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career studying the very creatures that might now scavenge his remains. His thoughts turned to Sarah, her laugh, the way she'd followed him through these same woods as a child, collecting pine cones and asking endless questions about every plant and animal. Would he see her soon? Warren had never been religious, preferring to find his spirituality in nature's patterns. But now, facing death, he found himself hoping for some reunion beyond the veil. The first stars appeared overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Warren tried to focus on their beauty, rather than the numbness creeping into his extremities. His breath formed small clouds in the increasingly frigid air. Strange how peaceful it felt now that the initial panic had subsided. Perhaps this was nature's mercy, this gradual surrender to the inevitable. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing. Warren tensed, his senses, honed by decades in the wilderness, instantly alert. That wasn't the sound of a small animal. Something larger moved in the shadows. Mountain lion. Bear. This late in the season, a bear should be preparing for hibernation, but food scarcity sometimes kept them active longer. Another snap. Closer now. Warren strained to turn his head toward the sound. Yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. 2 gleaming orbs suspended in darkness. A low, rumbling growl followed, raising the hair on Warren's arms. Not a mountain lion, then. Wolf. The animal emerged from the shadows with deliberate slowness. A large male, silver-gray with a darker mask around those intelligent yellow eyes. Old for a wolf, at least 8 or 9 years, Warren estimated automatically, falling back on professional habit even now. The animal's right hind leg bore a distinctive white scar, visible even in the dim light. Warren had expected to feel fear, but instead found himself filled with a strange calm. There were worse ways to go than becoming part of the natural cycle, feeding the very creatures he'd devoted his life to understanding. At least it would be quicker than freezing to death. The wolf circled him slowly, nostrils flaring as it processed Warren's scent. Warren knew wolves could smell illness, weakness. The animal stopped at his feet, head lowered, studying him with an intensity that seemed almost curious. "Go ahead, old boy," Warren whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I won't hold it against you." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. It took another step forward, then another, now close enough that Warren could feel its warm breath on his face. The massive jaws could crush his windpipe in seconds. Instead, the wolf sniffed him thoroughly, from his face to his paralyzed limbs, lingering over the area where his stroke had caused the most damage, as if detecting the misfiring neurons beneath the skin. Then, to Warren's utter astonishment, the animal turned in a tight circle and lay down beside him, pressing its warm body against Warren's increasingly cold one. Warren blinked in confusion. This wasn't predatory behavior. He'd observed wolves in the wild for over 40 years and had never seen anything like this outside of pack behavior with injured members. Yet this wolf, clearly a lone male from its size and scars, was treating him not as prey, but as what? Pack. The wolf's body heat began to seep through Warren's clothing, a blessed warmth against the night's increasing chill. Despite his scientific skepticism, Warren couldn't deny the evidence of his senses. The wolf was deliberately sharing body heat. Throughout that long night, the wolf remained. Twice it rose, circled the perimeter of the small clearing with ears alert to sounds Warren couldn't detect, then returned to press against him once more. By all rights, Warren should have slipped into hypothermia, but the animal's furnace-like body kept the deadly cold at bay. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light stretching through the trees. Warren had survived the night, but thirst now clawed at his throat. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen. Dehydration would kill him soon enough, even if he'd escaped freezing. The wolf rose, stretched, and fixed Warren with that same intelligent stare. Then, to Warren's continued amazement, it trotted to the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the underbrush. "Goodbye, friend," Warren whispered, assuming the animal had fulfilled whatever strange instinct had compelled it to stay the night and was now leaving to hunt. But within minutes the wolf returned. In its mouth was a large clump of moss dripping with water. Warren stared in disbelief as the wolf dropped the soaked moss beside his face, nudging it closer with its nose. The message seemed unmistakable. With tremendous effort, Warren managed to turn his head enough to suck the precious moisture from the moss. The water was cold, earthy, and the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. The wolf watched him drink, then picked up the moss again and disappeared once more. It returned with the moss freshly soaked, repeating this process until Warren's desperate thirst had eased. Warren's scientific mind raced with explanations. Coincidence? Some strange behavior conditioned by previous human contact? But none of his rational explanations seemed adequate for the methodical care this wild predator was showing. As morning warmed to midday, hunger joined thirst as Warren's companion. The wolf seemed to sense this too. It disappeared for longer this time, nearly an hour, before returning with something clutched gently in its massive jaws. Wild apples, small, tart, but edible. The wolf dropped them by Warren's good hand, watching expectantly. "You're feeding me?" Warren whispered, his scientific worldview crumbling in the face of this impossible behavior. The wolf sat on its haunches, yellow eyes unblinking. Warren managed to grasp one of the small apples with his functional left hand, bringing it painfully to his mouth. The tart juice burst across his tongue, the simple sugars sending a rush of energy through his depleted system. Thus began the strangest partnership of Warren's long life. Throughout that day and into the next night, the wolf remained. It brought water-soaked moss for Warren's thirst, It found more wild apples and later berries that Warren recognized as edible. It pressed its warm body against his when the temperature dropped. By the third day, Warren's hope had kindled from desperate ember to cautious flame. If the wolf continued to help him, if someone happened to hike this trail despite the season, maybe, just maybe, he might survive long enough to be found. But on the third night, fever took hold. Without his medications, the lingering effects of his stroke combined with exposure had weakened his system. Warren drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with Sarah's voice calling him home and Eleanor's tear-stained face as she drove away. Through his delirium, he was vaguely aware of the wolf's continued presence, a cool tongue lapping at his fevered face, the warmth of fur against his shivering body. Once, in a moment of clarity, he felt himself being dragged inch by painful inch across the forest floor. When awareness returned fully, Warren found himself in a different location. A small hollow beside a trickling stream. The wolf had somehow managed to drag him nearly 50 yards to water. "You're not ordinary, are you?" Warren whispered, his voice raspy from fever and thirst. The wolf tilted its head, those yellow eyes fixed on Warren's face with an intensity that seemed to transcend species. For the first time, Warren noticed something beyond the distinctive scar on the wolf's hind leg. The animal's left ear bore a small notch, as if a tiny piece had been removed, a marking that stirred something in Warren's memory, something he couldn't quite grasp through the fog of fever and exhaustion. As Warren sipped water from the stream with the wolf's assistance, a fragmented recollection surfaced. Years ago, how many? He'd been tracking a particular wolf pack for his research. There had been a young male, distinctive because of... The thought slipped away as fatigue claimed him once more. But before unconsciousness took him completely, Warren felt the wolf settle beside him, its muzzle resting protectively across his chest, as if to say, "I'm here. I won't leave you." And for the first time since Eleanor had driven away, Warren Mitchell slept without fear. By the fourth day, Warren's fever had broken, though weakness still gripped his body like a vice. The wolf's care had become increasingly sophisticated in ways that challenged everything Warren thought he knew about animal behavior. The creature not only brought water and food, but seemed to anticipate Warren's needs before he himself recognized them. That morning, Warren awoke to find the wolf dropping a strange object beside his hand. A plastic water bottle, empty but intact, likely discarded by a hiker months ago. The wolf nudged it toward the stream with its nose, then looked at Warren expectantly. "You want me to use this?" Warren's voice was stronger now, though speaking remained difficult. The wolf blinked slowly, almost like a nod, then pushed the bottle closer to the water. With tremendous effort, Warren stretched his functioning left arm toward the bottle. His fingers closed around it, and with the wolf's surprising help, nudging it at crucial moments, he managed to fill it in the stream. Having water he could drink without assistance was a small victory that felt monumental. As Warren sipped from the bottle, his mind cleared enough to access decades of professional knowledge. In 30 years of studying wolf behavior, he'd documented remarkable instances of problem-solving and adaptation. But this level of apparent understanding, bringing tools, responding to human needs, existed far outside documented scientific parameters. Unless a memory surfaced, distant yet suddenly vivid. 7 years ago, during his last major field study before Sarah's death, a young male wolf cub caught in an illegal trap near the northern edge of their property. The poor creature had been no more than 2 years old, its right hind leg nearly severed by the trap's cruel teeth. Warren had freed it, expecting the animal to flee or attack in pain-driven fear. Instead, the young wolf had remained surprisingly calm under his ministrations. Warren had brought it home, setting up a makeshift veterinary space in their shed. Sarah, visiting for the weekend, had helped tend the injured cub. "He's special, Dad," she'd said, watching the wolf's intelligent eyes track their movements. "Look how he observes everything." They'd named him Atlas for the way he seemed to carry the weight of his injury with dignified forbearance. For 3 weeks, they'd nursed him back to health, Warren documenting the remarkable recovery and unusual behavior in his research journal. The wolf had displayed an extraordinary capacity for trust, despite its wild nature. The day before they'd planned to release Atlas back into the wild, Sarah had attached a small identification tag to his ear, a tiny notch with a nearly microscopic tracking chip, part of Warren's ongoing research. The day after the release, Sarah had died on the icy road. Warren had abandoned the research in his grief, never downloading the tracking data. Atlas and his unusual cognitive abilities had been forgotten in the wake of their family tragedy. Now, looking at the wolf beside him, the distinctive scar on the right hind leg, the notched left ear, Warren felt a jolt of recognition that transcended his physical limitations. "Atlas?" he whispered, hardly daring to believe. "Is that you, boy?" The wolf's ears pricked forward at the name, its yellow eyes fixing on Warren's face with such intensity that Warren felt a chill unrelated to the November air. Could it possibly be the same animal? The timing fit. Atlas would be around 9 now, matching this wolf's apparent age. The scar location was right, though it had healed to a white line over the years, and the notched ear. Warren reached his trembling left hand toward the wolf's head. The animal didn't flinch, allowing Warren's fingers to gently trace the small notch in its ear, the exact size and shape Sarah had created. "Atlas," Warren repeated, his voice breaking. "You came back." The wolf, Atlas, pressed his muzzle against Warren's palm in what could only be described as recognition. Warren's scientific mind raced to rationalize this extraordinary coincidence. Wolves typically lived within a 50-mile territory. Their property was only 18 miles from this location. Atlas would have established his range after recovery, possibly becoming an alpha before being ousted by younger males, explaining his solitary status now. The distinctive identification Sarah had created had remained, allowing Warren to confirm his identity. But the deeper implications defied rational explanation. How had Atlas recognized Warren after 7 years? What instinct or intelligence had driven him to provide such specific care? The scientist in Warren sought logical answers, but the man, weakened, abandoned, yet somehow found, could only marvel at the mystery of it. Meanwhile, as Warren struggled to survive in the wilderness, Eleanor Mitchell returned to an empty house filled with ghosts. She moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, mechanically cleaning spaces that didn't need cleaning, organizing drawers already organized. Her hands trembled as she folded Warren's sweaters, placing them in boxes labeled "donation" that she knew she would never actually donate. She told herself she'd done the merciful thing. Warren had been suffering, trapped in a failing body. Their money was gone. The bank had sent a final foreclosure notice. In another month, they'd have been homeless anyway. Better a quick end in the dignity of nature than slow degradation in some state facility where he'd be warehoused with other forgotten elders. That's what she told herself as she scrubbed the kitchen floor at 3 a.m., the same spot she'd already scrubbed 3 times since returning. The knock at the door the next morning startled her from a fitful doze on the couch. Eleanor opened it to find Mike Henderson on the porch, a casserole dish in his weathered hands. "Thought you might need some food," he said, his shrewd eyes taking in her disheveled appearance. "Rough night?" "Just tired," Eleanor said, accepting the dish with a forced smile. "Thank you, Mike." "Warren doing okay today? Haven't seen him out on the porch lately." Eleanor had prepared for this. "He's at Mountain View Care Center," she said smoothly. "They had an opening unexpectedly. It's better for him there. Professional care round the clock." Mike's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. That's the place over in Missoula. Must be costing a pretty penny. Insurance, Eleanor said vaguely. Would you like some coffee? They sat at the kitchen table, making small talk that Eleanor barely registered. Mike mentioned a storm system moving in early this year. Eleanor nodded and poured more coffee. Mike asked about Warren's therapy schedule at the facility. Eleanor fabricated visiting hours and improvement reports. Throughout the conversation, Mike's eyes kept returning to small details around the kitchen. Warren's medication still lined up by the sink, his favorite mug on the drying rack, his jacket hanging by the door. Strange you didn't mention the move earlier, Mike said finally, setting down his mug. Must have been sudden. It was, Eleanor agreed, avoiding his gaze. They called with an opening and we had to decide right away. Mike nodded slowly. Well, when you visit him next, tell him I miss our chess games. After he left, Eleanor leaned against the closed door, heart hammering. Mike knew something wasn't right. She could see it in the way his eyes had lingered on Warren's belongings, in the careful way he'd phrased his questions. She hadn't anticipated how quickly the lies would compound. One phone call to Mountain View would expose everything. But surely Mike wouldn't check. They'd been neighbors for 30 years. He would take her word. Eleanor moved to the window, watching Mike's truck crawl down their long driveway. Instead of turning left toward his own property, he turned right, toward town, toward a cell signal strong enough to make a call. Panic fluttered in her chest. She needed to prepare, pack some things, perhaps drive to her sister's in Oregon. But her limbs felt leaden, her mind foggy with exhaustion and the weight of what she'd done. Instead, she sank into Warren's recliner and did something she hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. She wept, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed torn from some hidden reservoir within her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. "Warren, I'm so sorry." She wasn't sure if she was apologizing for abandoning him or for failing him long before that desperate act, for the resentment that had crept into her heart as she'd emptied his bedpan day after day, for the moments she'd caught herself wishing he would simply die in his sleep, releasing them both, for the person she'd become, someone unrecognizable even to herself. As darkness fell outside the cabin windows, Eleanor came to a decision. She would go back, find Warren's body, give him a proper burial at least. It was the only shred of dignity she could restore to them both. She rose on shaky legs and gathered supplies: a shovel, blankets, Warren's favorite flannel shirt. She would go at first light, retracing her route from 3 days ago. She would face what she had done, but Eleanor Mitchell would arrive too late to find her husband where she'd left him. By then, Atlas had already begun the remarkable process of saving Warren's life, a process that would soon intersect with Mike Henderson's growing suspicions and the mounting search operation taking shape in the small Montana community. As Eleanor prepared for her journey of atonement, Mike Henderson sat in the sheriff's office, his lined face grave as he shared his concerns with his former deputy and longtime friend, Sheriff Tom Burkett. "Something's not right, Tom," Mike said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Warren's medications were still there, his clothes, and Mountain View says they've never heard of him." Sheriff Burkett leaned back in his chair, considering. Could be she moved him to a different facility? Without his medications? Without his clothes? Mike shook his head. And her story kept changing. First it was, they called with an opening. Then later she said they'd been on the waiting list for months. Eleanor's hiding something, and I'm worried it involves Warren. You think she might have... The sheriff left the question unfinished. I don't know what to think, Mike admitted. But Warren Mitchell's been my friend for 30 years. If he's in trouble, I need to find him. The sheriff nodded slowly. All right. We'll start with a wellness check. See if we can locate him at other facilities. If that doesn't pan out, he didn't need to complete the thought. Both men understood the implications. As night fell over the Montana wilderness, 3 lives hung in precarious balance. Warren fighting for survival with his unlikely guardian, Eleanor drowning in the consequences of her desperate act, and Mike racing against time to uncover the truth before it was too late. And somewhere in the darkness between them, Atlas kept vigil, his yellow eyes gleaming with a purpose that transcended human understanding. Dawn broke on the 5th day with a pale, watery light filtering through pine boughs. Warren woke to find Atlas already alert, sitting at attention beside him like a guardian statue carved from silver-gray stone. During the night, the wolf had brought an unexpected treasure, a tattered piece of fabric that appeared to be from an old backpack, which now lay across Warren's chest, providing additional warmth. "Good morning, old friend," Warren whispered, his voice growing stronger each day despite his circumstances. Atlas responded with a gentle nudge of his muzzle against Warren's hand. In the 5 days since Eleanor had abandoned him, Warren had progressed from certain death to tentative hope. The water bottle Atlas had found allowed him to drink whenever thirst struck. The wolf continued to bring food: wild apples, berries, and once, remarkably, a packet of beef jerky still in its wrapper, likely dropped by a hiker. Warren's condition remained precarious. Without his medications, the weakness from his stroke seemed to be worsening slightly. His right side remained completely paralyzed, and occasionally his vision blurred or speech slurred more than usual. But he was alive, a miracle that rested squarely on the broad shoulders of the wolf who refused to leave his side. As morning brightened, Warren's thoughts turned to Eleanor. Not with hatred, surprisingly, but with a complex mix of sadness and understanding. In his most honest moments, he could admit he might have done the same in her position, crushed under the weight of endless care, financial ruin, and the slow erasure of the life they'd built together. "She broke, Atlas," he told the wolf, who listened with uncanny attentiveness. "We all have breaking points. Hers came when she looked at our bank account and saw the last $100, or maybe when she changed my clothes for the 3rd time in one day, or when she realized there would never be enough money for proper care." Atlas tilted his head, those intelligent yellow eyes fixed on Warren's face. "I don't hate her," Warren continued, finding strange comfort in speaking aloud to this unlikely companion. "I wish I did. It would be simpler. But after 47 years, I understand her too well." The wolf lay down beside him, head resting on paws, still listening. Warren's thoughts drifted to Sarah. He wondered if she would have understood her mother's actions. Sarah had been their peacemaker, the bridge between Warren's stoic practicality and Eleanor's emotional intensity. She would have found a solution that eluded both of them, just as she always had. "Your ear," Warren said suddenly, reaching with effort to touch the notched ear. "Sarah did that the day before." He couldn't finish the sentence, even now, 7 years later. Atlas raised his head at Sarah's name, ears pricked forward. "You remember her, don't you?" Warren whispered, a lump forming in his throat. "She helped me save your leg. Said you were the most beautiful creature she'd ever seen." Warren's vision blurred, this time not from his stroke, but from tears. Atlas moved closer, resting his large head gently on Warren's chest in what could only be described as comfort. Meanwhile, 18 miles away, Eleanor Mitchell prepared for her grim journey. She'd barely slept, plagued by nightmares of Warren's accusing eyes. She moved through the cabin methodically, gathering supplies with the detached efficiency of someone performing an autopsy on their own life. The shovel leaned by the door. Blankets and Warren's favorite flannel were folded in a bag. She'd added a bottle of his aftershave, the same pine-scented brand he'd used for 40 years. For the burial, she told herself, though some part of her recognized it as a desperate attempt to preserve something of him. Her hand hovered over the phone several times. One call to Mike could set everything in motion. Confession, arrest, the grinding wheels of justice. It would be simpler in some ways. The burden of secrecy already felt too heavy to bear. But each time her hand fell away. Not yet. Not until she'd found him. Not until she'd looked upon what she had done. Eleanor was halfway to her car when Mike's truck appeared on the driveway, kicking up dust in the morning light. Behind it came Sheriff Burkett's patrol vehicle, its light bar mercifully dark. Eleanor's heart stuttered. She knew immediately what this meant. Mike stepped out first, his face a mask of grim determination. "Eleanor," he said simply, "where's Warren?" She could have maintained the lie. Insisted on the care facility story, bought herself more time. But standing there in the cold morning air, the shovel still in her hand, Eleanor Mitchell found she had no more capacity for deception. "I'll take you to him," she said, her voice hollow. Sheriff Burkett approached, his expression professional, but not unkind. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to advise you that anything you say—" "I know my rights, Tom," Eleanor interrupted, suddenly looking every one of her 68 years. "I'll tell you everything, but first we need to find my husband." 20 minutes later, Eleanor sat in the back of the sheriff's vehicle directing them along the Forest Service road she'd taken 5 days earlier. Mike followed behind in his truck, his face visible in the rearview mirror, a study in controlled fury. "He couldn't talk anymore," Eleanor said unprompted, staring out at the passing trees. "Did you know that?" "The doctors said his speech might come back, but it didn't. Not really. Just sounds, grunts, the occasional word." My husband, the man who could name every plant in these woods, who lectured at universities, reduced to grunting like an animal. Sheriff Burkett remained silent, letting her talk. "The money was gone," she continued, her voice distant. "All of it, 40 years of savings. The second mortgage maxed out. They were going to take the house in January. Where would we go? A man who needs total care and a woman too old to work?" She turned to look at the sheriff, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Tom. I just want you to understand. I thought I was being merciful." When they reached the small clearing where Eleanor had left Warren, Sheriff Burkett stopped the car. "This is it?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak as she stared at the empty patch of ground where her husband should have been. Sheriff Burkett stepped out, followed by Mike from the second vehicle. Both men surveyed the area with professional assessment. "You're sure this is the place?" Mike asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. I left him right there, by that fallen log. He couldn't have moved on his own. Not more than a few inches." Sheriff Burkett crouched, examining the ground. "There's been activity here," he confirmed. "Signs of something, or someone, being dragged." He pointed to disturbed earth and broken vegetation leading away from the clearing. "Animal predation?" Mike asked grimly. The sheriff frowned, following the trail with his eyes. "Not necessarily. These marks are consistent with something being pulled, not torn apart. See how the path is narrow and continuous?" Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest like a guttering candle. "Could someone have found him? Out here? This time of year?" Mike shook his head. "Not likely." Sheriff Burkett stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Let's follow the trail. Mike, get the first aid kit from your truck. Mrs. Mitchell, you stay here." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm coming with you." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close." They followed the disturbed earth for nearly 50 yards, winding through underbrush toward the sound of running water. The trail ended at a small stream nestled in a natural hollow. "Tom!" Mike called suddenly, pointing. "Look at this!" Half buried in the soft earth by the stream was a plastic water bottle, clearly used recently. Nearby lay several apple cores and what appeared to be an empty beef jerky wrapper. "Someone's been here," Sheriff Burkett said, surveying the area with increasing interest. "Recently." "Warren couldn't have done this himself," Mike said. "Not in his condition." "Then who?" Eleanor began, but fell silent as Sheriff Burkett raised a hand in warning. At the edge of the hollow, movement caught their eye. Something large and gray watching them from the shadows. "Wolf," Mike breathed, instinctively reaching for the rifle in his truck cab. Sheriff Burkett put a restraining hand on Mike's arm. "Wait. Look at its behavior." The wolf wasn't displaying typical predatory posture. It stood watching them intently, neither approaching nor retreating, its body language curious rather than threatening. "It's not acting right," Mike muttered. "Wolves don't stand their ground like that with humans, unless they're rabid or protecting something." "Or someone," Sheriff Burkett added quietly. The wolf turned and trotted a few steps into the trees, then stopped and looked back at them, as if, "I think it wants us to follow," Eleanor whispered, the impossibility of the situation washing over her. Cautiously, the three humans followed the wolf deeper into the forest. After another 100 yards, they emerged into a small, sheltered ravine. The wolf stopped at the entrance, sitting on its haunches in an almost formal posture. And there, protected by an overhang of rock and wrapped in what appeared to be scraps of fabric, lay Warren Mitchell. He was pale, thin, clearly weakened, but unmistakably alive. His eyes were closed in sleep, his chest rising and falling with steady breath. Beside him lay a collection of wild apples, another water bottle, and what appeared to be a torn backpack repurposed as a blanket. "My God," Mike breathed. "He's alive!" Warren's eyes fluttered open at the sound of voices. For a moment, confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned, followed by a complex series of emotions too rapid to catalog. "Warren," Eleanor whispered, frozen at the edge of the ravine, unable to approach or retreat. Warren's gaze moved from Eleanor to Mike to Sheriff Burkett, then finally settled on the wolf, who had padded over to stand protectively beside him. With tremendous effort, Warren lifted his functioning left hand and placed it on the wolf's head. "At last," he managed, the word slow but distinct. Mike turned to Eleanor, bewilderment written across his weathered features. "Atlas, isn't that—" "The wolf cub," Eleanor finished, recognition dawning. "The one they rescued 7 years ago. Before Sarah—" She couldn't complete the sentence. Sheriff Burkett was already on his radio, calling for medical evacuation. Mike rushed forward to assess Warren's condition, his ranger training taking over. Only Eleanor remained rooted in place, overwhelmed by the miracle before her and the magnitude of what she had almost done. The wolf, Atlas, remained beside Warren, allowing Mike's approach, but watching Eleanor with unnervingly intelligent eyes. There was no aggression in his posture, only what Eleanor could only describe as judgment. "Warren," she said again, taking a tentative step forward. I didn't know." Warren's eyes met hers. In them, Eleanor saw not hatred or anger, but something far more devastating, understanding. With painful slowness, he formed a single word. "Why?" The simple question pierced Eleanor more deeply than any accusation could have. She sank to her knees at the edge of the ravine, suddenly unable to stand under the weight of her actions. "Because I failed," she whispered. "Because I couldn't do it anymore. Because I thought death would be kinder than what was coming for both of us." Warren held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with excruciating effort, he turned his head toward Atlas. The message was clear even without words. This animal had not abandoned him. This wild creature had shown more humanity than his wife of nearly 5 decades. Sheriff Burkett approached Eleanor, his expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to place you under arrest for attempted murder and elder abandonment." As he recited her rights, Eleanor barely heard the words. Her attention remained fixed on Warren and the silver-gray wolf beside him, an impossible partnership that had denied her the mercy of a clean end to her crime. In the distance, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades announced the approach of medical evacuation. Soon, Warren would be in a hospital, receiving the care he desperately needed. Atlas would likely disappear back into the wilderness, and Eleanor would face the consequences of her actions. Yet even as the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists, Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief. The lies were over. The crushing weight of care had been lifted, albeit in the most horrific way imaginable. Whatever came next, prison, disgrace, the hatred of her community, seemed almost welcome compared to the slow suffocation of her previous existence. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate against the enormity of her betrayal. Warren's eyes closed briefly, whether in acknowledgement or dismissal, Eleanor couldn't tell. When they opened again, they fixed not on her, but on Atlas, his hand still resting on the wolf's broad head. As the helicopter appeared overhead, stirring the trees with its powerful downdraft, Atlas stood alert but unafraid. The wolf seemed to understand that this mechanical bird meant help for his human charge, not danger. Mike bent close to Warren, speaking urgently over the growing noise. "The wolf. We need to secure it before the medical team arrives. It could be dangerous." Warren's response was immediate and unmistakable. His left hand gripped Atlas's fur with surprising strength, and he shook his head firmly. "No," he managed. "Friend." Mike looked from Warren to the wolf and back again, indecision clear on his face. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded. "Okay, Warren. I'll make sure they know." As the helicopter began its descent in a nearby clearing, Warren's hand moved from Atlas's fur to the wolf's distinctive scarred ear, the ear that bore Sarah's notch from 7 years earlier. The gesture seemed like a blessing, an acknowledgement of something profound passing between man and animal. Atlas stood perfectly still, accepting the touch, his yellow eyes never leaving Warren's face. In that moment, the bond between them transcended explanation, a wild creature and a broken man, each saving the other in ways that defied conventional understanding. Sheriff Burkett led Eleanor toward the helicopter landing zone, where she would be transported along with Warren, but under very different circumstances. As they walked away, Eleanor glanced back one last time at the tableau behind them. Her husband, frail but alive, his hand resting on the head of a wolf that had shown more loyalty than she had. In that moment, Eleanor Mitchell finally understood the full measure of what she had discarded. Not just a husband, but a man whose capacity for connection had somehow reached across the boundary between species, inspiring a loyalty she herself had failed to maintain. The irony was not lost on her as the helicopter blades churned the cold Montana air. She had abandoned Warren to die alone in nature. Instead, nature itself had risen to embrace him, sending an unlikely guardian when she had failed. And that, Eleanor realized as they led her away, was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. The helicopter descended into the parking lot of St. John's Regional Medical Center in Missoula, its blades slicing through the morning air with rhythmic precision. Medical staff rushed forward with a gurney as the doors slid open. Warren Mitchell emerged first, strapped to a backboard, an IV already running into his arm. The paramedics had worked efficiently during the 30-minute flight, stabilizing his condition while reporting his vital signs to the waiting emergency team. What they couldn't report, what they struggled to even comprehend, was the behavior of the large gray wolf that had refused to leave Warren's side. "The animal wouldn't let us approach at first," the flight paramedic explained to the bewildered ER doctor as they wheeled Warren inside. "Then the patient somehow communicated with it. It backed off just enough for us to work, but it followed the stretcher to the helicopter and tried to board." "A wild wolf?" the doctor asked incredulously. Not acting wild at all, the paramedic replied. More like a service dog. The sheriff's deputy had to physically restrain it when we lifted off. Behind them, Sheriff Burkett escorted Eleanor Mitchell, still in handcuffs, toward a waiting patrol car. Her eyes remained fixed on Warren until the hospital doors closed behind him. Only then did she allow herself to be guided into the back seat of the vehicle. "What will happen to him now?" she asked quietly as Sheriff Burkett closed the door. "The best care possible," he replied without emotion. "Judge Harmon has already been contacted. He's issuing an emergency order appointing a guardian ad litem for Warren given the circumstances." The implications hung in the air between them. Eleanor was no longer her husband's next of kin, at least not in any way that mattered. She had surrendered that right the moment she'd left him to die. "And me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Booking arraignment." "Probably tomorrow morning." Sheriff Burkett's voice softened slightly. "I've called Reverend Phillips. He'll meet us at the station. You should consider legal representation, Eleanor." She nodded absently, her mind already elsewhere, back in the forest with Warren and the wolf that had saved him. Atlas, Sarah's wolf. The impossible connection that had denied her the mercy of a clean ending to her crime. As the patrol car pulled away, she caught a glimpse of Mike Henderson standing alone in the hospital parking lot, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. Their eyes met briefly through the window. In his gaze, Eleanor saw not hatred, but something far worse. Disappointment so profound it cut through her remaining defenses like a scalpel. Inside the hospital, Warren was immediately surrounded by a team of specialists. The rural medical center had been briefed on his condition and had assembled appropriate personnel, a neurologist, a cardiologist, specialists in hypothermia and exposure. Blood was drawn, monitors attached, medications administered. Throughout the flurry of activity, Warren remained conscious but quiet, his eyes tracking the movements around him with the patient observation of a man accustomed to watching wildlife. When the neurologist attempted to assess his speech capacity, Warren responded with slow but deliberate words. "Atlas," he said clearly. "Wolf saved me." The doctor exchanged glances with her colleagues, clearly assuming delirium or confusion. "Mr. Mitchell, you're safe now. We're going to take good care of you." Warren's left hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping the doctor's wrist. "Listen," he insisted. "Wolf. Real. Mike knows." The neurologist gently disengaged his grip. "We'll talk more when you're stabilized, Mr. Mitchell. Right now, we need to get some scans and assess your condition." Warren subsided, conserving his limited energy. They wouldn't understand, not yet, but Mike had seen Atlas. Mike would explain. For now, Warren needed to focus on regaining his strength. The rest would follow. Back at the clearing where Warren had been found, Mike Henderson stood watching as a wildlife management officer approached the wolf with caution. Atlas sat calmly at the edge of the ravine, yellow eyes tracking every movement, but making no attempt to flee. "I've never seen behavior like this," the officer admitted, keeping a respectful distance. "He's not showing any signs of rabies or disease. If anything, he seems vigilant, like he's waiting for something." "He's waiting for Warren," Mike said with certainty. "They formed some kind of bond out here." The wildlife officer shook his head skeptically. "Wolves don't bond with humans like that, not wild wolves." "This one did," Mike insisted. "Warren called him Atlas, said he saved him." "Atlas?" The officer's eyebrows rose. "Wait, is this the same wolf from Dr. Mitchell's research project? The one with the ear tag?" Mike nodded. "I think so. Warren and his daughter rehabilitated a wolf cub about 7 years ago, tagged and released it for a tracking study. Then Sarah died and Warren abandoned the research." The wildlife officer studied the wolf with new interest. That would explain the notched ear, but still, this level of interaction with a human? It's unprecedented. So what happens to him now? Mike asked. Protocol would be capture and assessment, possibly relocation if he's showing habituation to humans. Mike's expression hardened. That wolf kept my friend alive for 5 days. If Warren pulls through, he'll want to know Atlas is safe. The wildlife officer considered this. Look, I can't just leave a wild predator hanging around. But I could recommend temporary placement at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center while we sort this out. Dr. Mitchell was well respected in the conservation community. People will listen if he advocates for special handling. If he recovers enough to advocate, Mike said grimly. The word "if" hung between them like a physical presence. Warren's condition remained precarious. The stroke, lack of medication, exposure, dehydration, any one of these could have killed him. Their cumulative effect might still prove fatal. As if sensing their discussion, Atlas stood and approached, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. The wolf's intelligence was unmistakable as he assessed the two men, head slightly tilted, ears forward. Remarkable animal, the wildlife officer murmured. I've worked with wolves for 15 years, and I've never seen one make eye contact like this. So you'll help? Mike pressed. The officer nodded slowly. I'll call the rehabilitation center. We'll need a specialized transport. Before he could finish, Atlas turned and trotted into the forest, disappearing among the trees with fluid grace. Guess he had other ideas, the officer said wryly. Mike stared at the spot where the wolf had vanished. He'll be back, he said with quiet certainty, when Warren needs him. At St. John's, Warren was wheeled into the ICU after a battery of tests. The preliminary results were cautiously optimistic. Despite his ordeal, his core body functions remained stable. The stroke damage hadn't progressed significantly. With proper medication, hydration, and care, his chances for recovery were good. Not to pre-stroke condition, but potentially back to his baseline of 2 weeks earlier. It's remarkable, the neurologist told Mike when he arrived at the hospital. By all rights, 5 days of exposure should have killed him, especially without his medications. Instead, his condition is stable. Dehydrated, yes. Malnourished, certainly. But alive and cognitively intact. He had help, Mike said simply. The neurologist frowned. So I've heard. The paramedics mentioned something about a wolf. We assumed it was confusion or hallucination from his ordeal. It wasn't, Mike replied. I saw it myself. A wolf stayed with him, brought him water and food, protected him. The doctor's expression remained skeptical. Mr. Henderson, with all due respect, I've lived in these mountains for 65 years, doctor, Mike interrupted. I know the difference between a wolf and a hallucination. This animal, Atlas, saved Warren's life, and Warren knows it. Before the neurologist could respond, a nurse hurried over from the ICU bay. Doctor, Mr. Mitchell is becoming agitated. He's trying to communicate something, but we can't understand. He keeps saying wolf and window. Mike followed them into Warren's room. His old friend lay connected to monitors and IV lines, his face pale, but his eyes alert and distressed. When he saw Mike, Warren's expression cleared slightly. Mike, he managed, the words slurred but recognizable. Window, look. Mike moved to the second-floor window that overlooked the hospital's rear grounds, which backed up against a wooded hillside. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the tree line, a flash of silver-gray movement caught his eye. Atlas stood at the forest boundary, perfectly still, yellow eyes fixed on the hospital building. I'll be damned, Mike breathed. He followed us here. Warren made a sound that might have been a laugh. Told you. Smart. The neurologist joined Mike at the window, squinting at the distant figure. That's the wolf? It tracked you to the hospital? 18 miles as the crow flies, Mike confirmed. Maybe 25 by ground. The doctor shook her head in amazement. That's not normal wolf behavior. Nothing about Atlas is normal, Warren said with effort, each word carefully formed. Special? Sarah knew. The mention of his daughter's name triggered a monitoring alarm as Warren's heart rate increased. The nurse moved quickly to assess him, but Warren waved her away, focusing his limited energy on communication. Notebook, he said to Mike. Cabin, my office. Find it. Mike nodded, understanding immediately. Your research journal on Atlas. I'll get it. Warren relaxed slightly, his eyes drifting back to the window where the wolf remained visible at the forest edge. He remembers, Warren whispered, more to himself than anyone else. After 7 years, he remembers. As medical staff continued their work, Mike slipped out to make a call. The Mitchell cabin needed to be secured, Warren's belongings protected, and there was a research notebook to find, evidence of a connection that defied conventional understanding. Across town, Eleanor Mitchell sat in an interview room at the county jail, her hands folded on the scarred metal table. Across from her, a public defender named Lisa Jacobson reviewed the preliminary charges. Attempted murder, elder abandonment. These are serious felonies, Mrs. Mitchell, the young attorney said, pushing her glasses up her nose. The prosecutor is talking 20 years minimum. Eleanor nodded absently. I understand. With your age and lack of prior record, we might negotiate down considerably, but I need to know everything if I'm going to help you. Why did you do it, Mrs. Mitchell? Eleanor met the younger woman's eyes. Have you ever been a caregiver, Ms. Jacobson? No, but then you can't understand, Eleanor said quietly. Not really. It's not just the physical toll, though that's substantial. It's the slow death of everything else, your identity, your future, your finances, your independence. She looked down at her hands, hands that had changed thousands of diapers, administered countless medications, lifted a man twice her weight from bed to chair and back again. I loved my husband for 47 years, she continued. I thought I would always love him. But somewhere between the 3rd bankruptcy notice and the 5th bed sore, something broke inside me. Love became duty. Duty became resentment. Resentment became desperation. The attorney made notes, her expression carefully neutral. The prosecution will argue premeditation. The fact that you drove him to a remote location, that you ensured he couldn't call for help. I did those things, Eleanor interrupted. I'm not denying it. I left my husband of nearly 5 decades to die alone in the wilderness because I couldn't bear what our lives had become. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. What I didn't count on was a wolf showing more humanity than I could manage. The irony would be almost beautiful if it weren't so damning. Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise. A knock at the door interrupted them. A corrections officer entered, followed by Sheriff Burkett. Sorry to interrupt, he said, nodding to the attorney. There's been a development. Judge Harmon wants Mrs. Mitchell at the hospital. The hospital? Lisa Jacobson frowned. Why? Her husband is asking for her. Eleanor's head snapped up, disbelief written across her features. Warren wants to see me after what I did? Sheriff Burkett's expression gave nothing away. Those are my instructions. Judge Harmon will meet us there, along with Mr. Mitchell's court-appointed guardian. You'll remain in custody, of course. 20 minutes later, Eleanor found herself being escorted through the hospital corridors, handcuffs hidden beneath a light jacket to avoid disturbing other patients. Sheriff Burkett kept a firm hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the ICU. Outside Warren's room, an imposing woman in a charcoal suit introduced herself as Andrea Patel, Warren's court-appointed guardian ad litem. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were cold as she assessed Eleanor. "Mr. Mitchell has specifically requested to speak with you," she said crisply. "Given the circumstances, this is highly irregular, but Judge Harmon has allowed it. You will be supervised at all times. If Mr. Mitchell shows any sign of distress, you will be removed immediately. Is that clear?" Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. "One more thing," Andrea added. "Mr. Mitchell's speech is still affected by his stroke. He tires easily when trying to communicate. So listen carefully. He may not have the strength to repeat himself." With that warning, she opened the door to Warren's room. The sight of her husband in the hospital bed nearly brought Eleanor to her knees. Warren had always been robust, powerful, a man who commanded physical respect even into his 70s. Now he seemed diminished, his frame lost among the monitoring equipment and IV lines. But his eyes, those clear blue eyes that had first captured her attention at a college mixer nearly 50 years earlier, remained sharp and alert. They fixed on her the moment she entered, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Warren," she whispered, unable to find other words. He studied her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak but determined, each word carefully formed. "Why did you come back?" The question confused her. "The sheriff brought me. They said you wanted to see me." Warren shook his head slightly, the movement clearly requiring effort. "No, the forest. Why, go back?" Understanding dawned. He was asking why she'd returned to the clearing, why she'd been with Mike and the sheriff when they found him. "To bury you," she admitted, the stark truth hanging in the sterile hospital air. "To give you that much, at least." Warren's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, something had shifted in them, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a fragment of understanding. "Atlas," he said. "Wolf? Sarah's wolf." Eleanor nodded. "I recognized him. The notched ear. After all these years." "Saved me," Warren continued. "When you couldn't." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. She swayed slightly, grateful for the sheriff's steadying hand at her elbow. "I failed you," she whispered. "I failed us both." Warren's left hand moved slightly on the blanket, a gesture Eleanor recognized from decades of marriage. He wanted to say more but was searching for the right words, a scholar's habit, conserving language until he found precisely the right expression. "System failed," he said finally. "Not just you." Before Eleanor could respond, Warren's attention shifted to the window. Following his gaze, she gasped softly. At the edge of the forest, visible beyond the hospital grounds, stood a large silver-gray wolf, motionless as a statue, watching. "He followed us," she breathed. "All the way here." Warren nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Loyal," he said. Then, with clear effort, "unlike us." The plural pronoun wasn't lost on Eleanor. Not unlike you, unlike us. A subtle but profound distinction that acknowledged mutual failure rather than placing blame solely on her shoulders. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Warren's expression grew tired, the effort of communication clearly taking its toll. "Don't know," he admitted, "but Atlas showed something important." "What's that?" Eleanor asked. Warren's eyes met hers directly. "Second chances," he said, "even for broken things." With those words, his energy seemed to flag. The monitor showed increasing fatigue. Andrea Patel stepped forward immediately. "That's enough for today," she said firmly. "Mr. Mitchell needs rest." Eleanor nodded, understanding. As Sheriff Burkett guided her toward the door, she paused for one last look at her husband. Warren's eyes were already closing. exhaustion claiming him, but his left hand raised slightly in a gesture that might have been farewell, or perhaps something more complex. Outside in the corridor, Eleanor found herself face to face with Mike Henderson. His expression remained guarded, but some of the earlier fury had ebbed. "He's stronger than anyone expected," Mike said. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "I found his research journal," Mike continued, "the one about Atlas. It's remarkable reading. Warren documented cognitive abilities in that wolf that should be impossible. Problem-solving, memory. Even what he called empathetic response, the ability to recognize and respond to human emotional states. "Sarah always said that Wolf was special," Eleanor whispered. "I thought it was just a daughter indulging her father's research." "It was more than that," Mike replied. "Warren believes Atlas recognized him after 7 years, remembered him from when they saved his life, and somehow returned the favor." As Sheriff Burkett led her away, Eleanor glanced back one last time at Warren's door. The impossible had already happened, a wild wolf saving her abandoned husband. Was it equally impossible to think that something broken beyond repair might somehow find a path to healing? The answer lay beyond her grasp as they led her back to the waiting patrol car. But somewhere in the space between what she had done and what might yet be, Eleanor Mitchell found the first fragile seedling of hope. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. "Abandoned husband saved by wolf," screamed the Missoula Tribune's headline, accompanied by a grainy photo of Atlas at the forest's edge near the hospital. By Wednesday, national news vans had descended on the small Montana community, reporters hungry for details of the miraculous survival story and the shocking betrayal that preceded it. Eleanor Mitchell's face appeared on television screens across America, her booking photo juxtaposed against decades-old wedding pictures. Commentators debated the case with righteous indignation or solemn understanding, depending on their audience. The phrase caregiver burnout entered the national lexicon alongside elder abandonment, sparking heated discussions about America's healthcare system and the burden placed on family caregivers. From her cell in the county jail, Eleanor watched none of it. She sat on the thin mattress, a paperback novel open but unread on her lap, her thoughts fixed on Warren's words. Second chances, even for broken things. Down the hall, her attorney, Lisa Jacobson, was engaged in intense negotiation with District Attorney Robert Calloway, a man known for his tough stance on elder abuse cases. "My client understands the gravity of her actions," Lisa argued, sliding a document across the conference table. "But the circumstances are exceptional. We're proposing a plea agreement that acknowledges both the crime and the systemic failures that contributed to it." The DA scanned the document, his expression skeptical. "Attempted involuntary manslaughter instead of attempted murder. Care facility negligence as a mitigating factor. Mrs. Mitchell left her partially paralyzed husband alone in the wilderness to die. Misma Jacobson." The fact that a wild animal showed more compassion than she did doesn't exactly help her case. "No," Lisa acknowledged, "but it does highlight the desperation that drove her actions." Eleanor Mitchell had no criminal history. She was a nurse for 30 years before retiring to care for her husband. She spent 18 months providing round-the-clock care with minimal support from our healthcare system. "That doesn't justify attempted murder. It contextualizes a human breaking point," Lisa countered, "and there's something else to consider. Warren Mitchell doesn't want his wife in prison." The DA's eyebrows rose. "He's communicated this?" "To his guardian ad litem and his doctors. He understands what Eleanor did, but he also understands why. He's asking for restorative justice, not punitive." DA Calloway leaned back, considering. "The public wants blood on this one. I've got senior advocacy groups calling for maximum sentencing. And I've got healthcare reform advocates pointing out that the Mitchells are victims of a broken system, Lisa replied. Plus, the media circus around a trial would be brutal for Warren's recovery. A plea deal gives everyone something: justice, acknowledgement, and a path forward. The DA tapped his pen against the document, his expression thoughtful. I'll need to speak with Warren Mitchell myself, and the terms would need adjustment. Of course, Lisa said, relief evident in her voice. And there's one more thing. Warren wants Atlas protected. The wolf. The wolf? The DA's expression shifted to incredulous. What does that have to do with criminal proceedings? Everything, Lisa said simply. According to Warren, that wolf represents the redemptive element in this entire tragedy. He's asking for special protected status as part of any agreement moving forward. D.A. Calloway shook his head, bemused. First time I've had wildlife protection included in a plea negotiation, but if it helps close this case reasonably. He gathered the documents with a sigh. I'll be in touch by tomorrow. At St. John's Regional Medical Center, Warren Mitchell sat propped up in his bed, his condition steadily improving under proper medical care. The stroke medications had been rebalanced, physical therapy had begun, and his speech, while still labored, was becoming clearer each day. Mike Henderson sat beside him, watching as Warren paged through his old research journal with his functioning left hand. 7 years, Warren said, tapping a photograph of Sarah kneeling beside a young Atlas, the wolf cub's injured leg freshly bandaged. She loved that animal. Mike nodded, studying the image of Warren's daughter, her bright smile so full of life, unaware that within 24 hours she would be gone forever. Sarah had your gift with animals. Always did. Warren turned another page, revealing detailed notes about Atlas's recovery and cognitive development. Not just instinct, he said, pointing to his observations. Problem-solving, memory, connection. The neurologist is interested in your research, Mike mentioned. Dr. Abrams. She says there's growing evidence that some canids have cognitive abilities far beyond what science previously recognized. Your documentation of Atlas could be significant. Warren nodded absently, his attention caught by a particular entry. Sarah's handwriting appeared alongside his own, noting, Atlas watches our faces before our hands, reading intention, not just action. She saw it first, Warren said softly. The difference in him. A knock at the door interrupted them. Andrea Patel entered, her professional demeanor slightly softened compared to previous visits. Mr. Mitchell, you have a visitor, she announced. District Attorney Calloway is here to discuss your wife's case. Warren closed the journal, his expression composed. Send him in. D.A. Calloway entered, shaking hands with Warren and acknowledging Mike with a nod. After exchanging pleasantries and inquiring about Warren's recovery, he got to the point. Mr. Mitchell, I understand you've expressed opposition to pursuing maximum charges against your wife. I'd like to hear your reasoning directly. Warren took a careful breath, organizing his thoughts before speaking to conserve energy. 47 years, he began. Not perfect, but good. Eleanor broke. System broke her. The system? Calloway prompted. Healthcare, insurance, everything. Warren elaborated with effort. No options, no money, no help. That doesn't excuse leaving you to die, the DA pointed out gently. No, Warren agreed, but explains it. Desperate people, desperate choices. And yet you don't want her to face full consequences for those choices? Warren's eyes, clear and intelligent despite his physical limitations, fixed on the DA with surprising intensity. What's the point? He asked simply. Punishment fixes nothing. Broken system. Still broken. Eleanor in prison. Just more broken pieces. D.A. Calloway studied him thoughtfully. What outcome are you hoping for, Mr. Mitchell? Restorative, Warren replied. not punitive. Eleanor needs help, not a cell, and Atlas needs protection. Yes, your attorney mentioned the wolf, Calloway said. I'm not sure how that factors into criminal proceedings. Warren gestured for Mike to hand him something from the bedside table. It was a formal letter, already drafted, bearing the Montana Wildlife Conservation Department letterhead. Petition, Warren explained. Special protected status. Atlas isn't ordinary wolf. Research subject. Scientific importance. The DA accepted the document with raised eyebrows. You've been busy for someone in recovery. A ghost of a smile touched Warren's lips. Motivation, he said simply. As they continued discussing terms for a potential plea agreement, Warren's gaze periodically drifted to the window. Outside, at the now familiar spot where Forest met hospital grounds, the silver-gray figure of Atlas remained vigilant. For 5 days, the wolf had maintained his post, appearing each morning at dawn and departing at dusk, visible to hospital staff and visitors alike. Wildlife officers had attempted to approach him once, only to have the animal retreat temporarily into the forest before reappearing at a safer distance. After consulting with Warren, they had agreed to leave Atlas undisturbed as long as he presented no threat, a decision supported by the growing public fascination with the guardian wolf story. By the time D.A. Calloway departed, the outlines of an agreement had taken shape. Eleanor would plead guilty to reduced charges, with sentencing focused on rehabilitation rather than incarceration. In exchange, Warren would support initiatives to reform caregiver support systems and raise awareness about elder care challenges. And Atlas would receive special protected status under Montana conservation laws, with Warren's research forming the basis for a new study on wolf cognition and interspecies relationships. "Do you think she'll accept the terms?" Mike asked after the DA had gone. Warren nodded slowly. "She will. Alternative is worse." "And after that? What happens to you two?" Warren's expression grew distant. "Don't know," he admitted. "Can't go back. Maybe something new." Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat across from Lisa Jacobson in the jailhouse consultation room, reviewing the proposed plea agreement. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "He did this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Warren arranged this?" Lisa nodded. He was quite clear about wanting a restorative approach. The DA was reluctant, but Warren can be persuasive, even with his speech limitations. Eleanor stared at the document, overwhelmed by its implications. Instead of 20 years in prison, she was looking at 5 years probation, mandatory counseling, community service focused on caregiver support, and a suspended sentence that could be activated if she violated the terms. "Why?" she asked simply. "After what I did." "I can't speak to his motivations," Lisa replied. "But when I spoke with him, he mentioned something about a wolf teaching more about humanity than humans had managed lately." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, the image of Atlas standing guard over Warren etched in her memory. "When can I see him again?" "If you accept the plea, arrangements can be made within the week. Judge Harmon is expediting the process given the circumstances." Eleanor signed without further hesitation. 3 days later, she sat in a conference room at St. John's, no longer in handcuffs, but still under supervision. Warren was wheeled in by a nurse looking markedly improved from their last meeting. Some color had returned to his face, and his posture was stronger, more alert. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, decades of shared history hanging in the air between them. "You look better," Eleanor said finally. "Good care," Warren replied, a hint of irony in his tone. Eleanor accepted the subtle rebuke with a small nod. "I've signed the agreement," she said. "Thank you for not wanting me in prison." "Wouldn't help," Warren said pragmatically. Need to fix things, not break more. Can things be fixed, Warren? She asked, the question encompassing far more than legal proceedings. After what I did? Warren considered this, his analytical mind weighing the question as carefully as he had once evaluated scientific data. Don't know, he admitted, but Atlas showed possibility. The wolf, Eleanor said softly. 7 years, Warren continued. Remembered, forgave, helped. It's different, Eleanor protested gently. I'm not a wolf you rescued. I'm a wife who betrayed you. Same principle, Warren insisted. Choice to help or harm. Atlas chose help. I'm choosing possibility. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. I don't deserve it. Not about deserving, Warren said, his voice growing tired but his words clear. About what helps us heal. All of us. Their conversation was necessarily brief due to Warren's limited stamina, but before Eleanor left he asked her to look out the window. Atlas stood at his usual post, silver fur gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Loyalty, Warren said, watching the wolf. Not just instinct. Choice. As Eleanor was escorted back to the county jail to await final processing of her plea agreement, she carried that image with her. A wild creature choosing to stand guard, to remember, to remain faithful despite every natural instinct to the contrary. The media coverage shifted following the announcement of the plea agreement. Outrage gave way to nuanced discussion about caregiver support, healthcare reform, and the ethical complexities of elder care. Eleanor Mitchell became simultaneously a cautionary tale and a symbol of a systemic failure that pushed ordinary people to desperate measures. Warren's request for special protection for Atlas gained unexpected traction, with conservation groups rallying behind the effort. The wolf that had saved a man abandoned by his own wife captured the public imagination, transcending the simple categories of wild versus tame, predator versus protector. A week after the plea agreement was finalized, Eleanor was released from county jail, and she emerged into bright sunshine to find Mike Henderson waiting beside his truck. Warren asked me to pick you up, he explained, his manner civil but reserved. You'll be staying at my guest cabin for now. Terms of your probation. Eleanor nodded, clutching the small bag containing her belongings. How is he? Improving, Mike replied as he opened the passenger door for her. They're transferring him to a rehabilitation facility tomorrow. 6 to 8 weeks of intensive therapy, then reassessment. And the cabin? Eleanor asked as they drove through Missoula's outskirts toward the mountains. What's happening with our home? Mike's expression softened slightly. Warren had me contact the bank. They've agreed to a modification based on hardship circumstances. The publicity helped, honestly. No bank wants to be seen foreclosing on a man who survived abandonment through the help of a wild wolf. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. And Atlas? Eleanor asked after a long silence. Still maintaining his vigil at the hospital, Mike said. The Wildlife Department has agreed to Warren's request. Atlas has been designated a subject of special scientific interest and granted protected status within a 50-mile radius. They're setting up a research project based on Warren's old notes. Eleanor stared out the window at the passing landscape, the mountains and forests that had nearly become her husband's final resting place. It's all so impossible, she murmured. A wolf remembering a kindness from 7 years ago. A man forgiving the wife who left him to die. What happens now, Mike? How do we move forward from something like this? Mike was silent for several miles, navigating the winding mountain road with practiced ease. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weathered wisdom of his 65 years. When I was 12, my father took me hunting up near Glacier. Got caught in a freak blizzard, separated from our group. We found shelter in an old ranger cabin, but Dad had fallen through ice. Hypothermia was setting in fast. He paused, eyes fixed on the road, but seeing something far more distant. He told me to leave him, find help, save myself. I refused, stayed with him all night, keeping him warm best I could. Rescue found us next morning. Another long pause, then, Dad never forgave me for disobeying him. Said I risked my life unnecessarily. We barely spoke for years after. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. He was angry that you saved him? Mike nodded. Some people can't accept being saved. Their pride won't allow it. Others can't forgive themselves for needing rescue in the first place. His gaze flicked briefly to Eleanor. Warren isn't either type. He understands both sides, the desperation that drove you to abandon him and the loyalty that drove Atlas to save him. That understanding is rare. As they turned onto a narrow dirt road leading to Mike's property, Eleanor caught a glimpse of movement in the forest alongside them, a flash of silver gray keeping pace with the truck. "Mike?" she whispered, pointing. He nodded, unsurprised. "Atlas has been tracking between the hospital and my property since yesterday, almost like he knows Warren is being moved." "How could he know that?" Mike shrugged. "Same way he knew to find Warren in the first place. Some things defy explanation, Eleanor." As they pulled up to the small guest cabin, Atlas emerged from the tree line, sitting at a respectful distance, yellow eyes fixed on Eleanor with unnerving intelligence. "He's watching me," she whispered, suddenly afraid to exit the vehicle. "Assessing you," Mike corrected. "Same as he did with the medical team, same as he's done with everyone who approaches Warren." Eleanor studied the wolf with new understanding. He's still protecting Warren. "Even from me." "Especially from you," Mike confirmed quietly. "But Warren asked that Atlas be allowed to make his own choice. No interference." Slowly, Eleanor opened the truck door and stepped out. Atlas remained perfectly still, watching her every movement. She took a tentative step toward the wolf, then stopped, uncertain. "What do I do?" she asked Mike, who had joined her. "Wait," he advised. "Let him decide." For what seemed an eternity, Eleanor stood motionless as Atlas studied her. Then, with deliberate grace, the wolf rose and approached. He stopped several feet away, still maintaining a safety buffer, but close enough that Eleanor could see the intelligence in those amber eyes, the distinctive notch in his ear. Sarah's mark. "Hello, Atlas," she said softly. "I remember you too. Sarah loved you very much." At the mention of Sarah's name, the wolf's ears pricked forward. Then, to Eleanor's astonishment, Atlas lowered his head slightly before turning and trotting back toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused, looking back once, as if to ensure she remained in place. "What just happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice unsteady. Mike watched the wolf disappear among the trees. "I believe," he said slowly, "you just received conditional acceptance. Not forgiveness. That would be anthropomorphizing. But acknowledgement. Recognition. From a wolf? From the creature that saved your husband when you couldn't or wouldn't." Mike's voice held no judgment, only observation. "Atlas is the bridge between what happened and what comes next, Eleanor. For all of us." As darkness fell over the small cabin, Eleanor sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching the forest edge where Atlas had disappeared. "Somewhere out there," the wolf continued his self-appointed vigil, moving between hospital and cabin, maintaining connection with the human he had saved through some inexplicable bond that transcended conventional understanding. In that quiet moment, Facing the wilderness that had nearly claimed her husband and the long, uncertain path toward whatever redemption might be possible, Eleanor Mitchell finally allowed herself to weep, not from self-pity or fear of punishment, but from a deeper recognition of how close she had come to destroying something irreplaceable, and how, through the most unlikely intervention, she had been granted what Warren had named so precisely, a second chance for broken things. Warren Mitchell's research journal lay open on Dr. Abrams' desk, the neurologist's expression a mixture of scientific skepticism and reluctant fascination as she reviewed his meticulous notes. 7 years ago, you documented cognitive abilities in this wolf that exceed anything in current literature, she said, looking up at Warren, who sat across from her in a wheelchair. 6 weeks into his rehabilitation at Clearwater Recovery Center, his improvement had been remarkable. Speech therapy had restored much of his verbal communication, though he still spoke with deliberate care. Physical therapy had returned limited mobility to his right side, enough to assist with transfers and some self-care, though he would likely always need the wheelchair for distance. Atlas was exceptional from the beginning, Warren replied, tapping a page where he'd noted the young wolf's problem-solving abilities. Sarah recognized it first. She said he watched our eyes, not our hands. Seeking connection, not just food. Dr. Abrams nodded, turning to another section. And now he's demonstrated long-term memory, recognition of specific humans after 7 years, and what can only be described as caregiving behaviors. It's unprecedented. Not unprecedented, Warren corrected gently. Just undocumented. Indigenous knowledge has recognized these capabilities for centuries. Western science is catching up. The neurologist smiled at the gentle rebuke. Fair point, which is why I believe your research could form the foundation for an important study, one that bridges wildlife biology and cognitive science. Warren's eyes drifted to the window, where the Montana winter had finally arrived in earnest. Snow blanketed the rehabilitation center's grounds, and beyond them the forest where Atlas maintained his vigil. The wolf had adapted his pattern since Warren's transfer 6 weeks earlier, dividing his time between the rehabilitation center and Mike's property, where Eleanor remained under the terms of her probation. I'm interested, Warren said, returning his attention to Dr. Abrams. But with conditions. Of course. Atlas remains free, no captivity, no invasive testing, observation only on his terms. Dr. Abrams nodded. The Montana Conservation Department has already agreed to those parameters. Director Samuelson was quite impressed by your previous work. And Eleanor is involved, Warren added, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. This stipulation clearly surprised the neurologist. Your wife, given the circumstances. She was there at the beginning, Warren explained, with Sarah. She knows Atlas's history, and she needs purpose. Dr. Abrams studied him thoughtfully. You're an unusual man, Dr. Mitchell. Most people in your position wouldn't want their wife anywhere near a research project after what she did. Warren's expression remained composed. Most people haven't had 6 weeks of nothing but time to think about forgiveness and second chances. Is that what this is? Forgiveness? It's more complicated than that, Warren replied. Eleanor broke under impossible pressures. The system failed her before she failed me. Understanding that doesn't excuse what she did, but it provides context. And Atlas? Dr. Abrams asked. How does he fit into this reconciliation? Warren smiled slightly. He's the bridge, the unexpected variable that changed everything. Science is about examining anomalies, Dr. Abrams. Atlas is certainly that. By late January, the research project had taken shape. Montana State University had partnered with the Wildlife Conservation Department, providing funding and academic oversight. Warren would serve as lead researcher, with Dr. Abrams consulting on the cognitive aspects. A small team had been assembled, including 2 graduate students in wildlife biology and a videographer to document Atlas's behaviors. And most controversially, Eleanor Mitchell had been granted a limited role, assisting with historical documentation and administrative tasks, activities that satisfied her community service requirements while keeping her involved in Warren's work. The arrangement raised eyebrows and prompted concerned calls to the university president. How could they involve a woman who had abandoned her husband to die? Wasn't this rewarding criminal behavior? The university's careful response emphasized restorative justice, rehabilitation, and the unique circumstances of the case. What silenced most critics was Warren's unequivocal support. In his first public statement since the incident, released through the university's press office, he wrote, "The path to healing is not through punishment, but through purposeful reconstruction." Eleanor's involvement in this project represents one step on that difficult journey. Atlas showed unexpected mercy. We would do well to learn from his example. On a frigid February morning, the research team gathered at the small field station they'd established at the edge of the wildlife preserve adjacent to Mike Henderson's property. Warren directed operations from his wheelchair, a specially equipped van allowing him mobility between sites. The graduate students monitored trail cameras that tracked Atlas's movements through his territory. Dr. Abrams reviewed cognitive assessment protocols. Eleanor worked quietly in the corner, digitizing Warren's old research notes, her head bent over a laptop. She spoke little, acutely aware of the sideways glances from team members who knew her history. The weight of what she had done hung around her like an invisible cloak, tangible in every interaction. During a break, Warren wheeled himself to her workstation. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice casual, as if they were simply colleagues rather than a husband and the wife who had left him to die. "Almost finished with the 2018 notes," Eleanor replied, not meeting his eyes. "Sarah's observations were remarkably insightful. She noticed patterns you didn't initially document." Warren nodded. "She had a natural gift, less scientific bias than me." The mention of their daughter created a moment of shared connection, a brief suspension of the chasm between them. Both looked at Sarah's handwriting on the scanned page, her enthusiastic notations about Atlas's development. "I miss her," Eleanor said softly. "Every day." "Me too," Warren agreed. "I thought I saw her, you know. When I was in the forest with Atlas. Fever dreams, probably." Eleanor finally met his gaze. "What did she say?" "In your dreams?" "That I needed to hold on. That help was coming in an unexpected form." Warren's eyes held Eleanor's steadily. And she was right. Before Eleanor could respond, one of the graduate students burst into the field station, excitement overriding his usual awkwardness around her. "Dr. Mitchell, Atlas is approaching the north observation point with something in his mouth. It looks deliberate." The team mobilized quickly, Warren directing operations through a radio as those in the field positioned themselves at respectful distances from the observation point, a small clearing where they'd placed items with Warren's scent to see if Atlas would interact with them. Through binoculars, they watched as the silver-gray wolf emerged from the tree line, moving with purpose. In his mouth was an object, something long and cylindrical. "What is that, Doctor?" Abrams murmured, adjusting her binoculars. The videographer zoomed in, the camera feed displaying on monitors inside the field station. "It looks like a thermos, an old one." Warren leaned forward, studying the image with intense concentration. "It's mine," he said suddenly. "From my old field kit. I lost it years ago during a research expedition, before Sarah died." They watched as Atlas approached the observation point, carefully placed the thermos beside the scent items, then retreated to a respectful distance, sitting on his haunches as if waiting. "He's bringing you gifts," Dr. Abrams said, amazement evident in her voice. "Objects connected to you." "Not gifts," Warren corrected. "Messages. Proof of connection." When the team retrieved the thermos, they found it remarkably intact, despite years in the wilderness. The exterior was scratched and weathered, but Warren's initials remained visible on the bottom. WJM. How would he even find this? One of the graduate students wondered. And why bring it now? Association, Warren explained. He's making connections between past and present, demonstrating memory and meaning. The discovery energized the research team, leading to a flurry of new hypotheses and observation protocols. Over the following weeks, Atlas continued to demonstrate behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of wolf cognition. He maintained his territorial patrol between the rehabilitation center, the field station, and Mike's cabin where Eleanor stayed. He brought 3 more objects from Warren's past: an old glove, a field compass, and most remarkably, a faded bandana that had belonged to Sarah. This last item reduced Eleanor to tears when she recognized it. "She was wearing this the day we released him," she whispered. "She used it to wipe his face before we let him go." The implications were profound. Atlas wasn't just remembering Warren. He was connecting the entire family unit in his understanding. His behavior suggested a cognitive map far more complex than science had previously attributed to his species. Dr. Abrams began drafting a preliminary paper for submission to Nature, careful to balance scientific objectivity with the remarkable data they were gathering. "We need to acknowledge the limitations," she cautioned during a team meeting. "Single subject observation, potential for anthropomorphizing, the unique circumstances of Atlas's early contact with humans." "Document what we see," Warren insisted. "Without excessive interpretation. The data speaks for itself." As winter gave way to early spring, Warren's rehabilitation progressed to the point where his medical team approved his return home, with conditions. The Mitchell cabin would need modifications: a wheelchair ramp, bathroom renovations, wider doorways. Mike Henderson volunteered to oversee the construction, recruiting friends from the community to assist. The question hanging over these preparations remained unspoken but omnipresent. Would Eleanor return home with Warren? Her probation terms allowed for it, with appropriate supervision and continued counseling. The restorative justice approach emphasized rebuilding rather than permanent separation. But neither Warren nor Eleanor had directly addressed the possibility. They worked together on the research project with professional courtesy, their interactions gradually warming from the initial awkward tension to something resembling comfortable familiarity. Yet the fundamental breach of trust remained an invisible barrier between them. In late March, as the cabin renovations neared completion, Warren finally broached the subject during a private moment at the field station. "The contractor says the modifications will be finished next week," he said, watching Eleanor's reaction carefully. "I'll be moving back then." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the computer screen where she'd been entering data. "That's good news. You'll be more comfortable there." "The question is," Warren continued deliberately, "will you be there too?" Eleanor's hands stilled on the keyboard. She didn't look up. "Do you want me there?" "It's not that simple." "It should be," she countered softly. "After what I did, it should be a simple yes or no." Warren shook his head. "Nothing about this situation is simple, Eleanor. Not my feelings, not your actions, not our future." Finally, she met his gaze. "I don't know how to live with what I did to you. Even with the plea agreement, even with your support. I don't know how to move forward carrying this." "Atlas might have some insight on that," Warren suggested, a hint of his old dry humor surfacing. "A wolf? A creature who was injured, who healed, who remembered both the injury and the healing, and who chose to act based on the latter," rather than the former. Warren's eyes held hers steadily. There's wisdom in that approach. Before Eleanor could respond, the radio crackled with an urgent message from one of the field researchers. Dr. Mitchell, we've got a situation. Atlas is displaying agitated behavior at the north boundary. There appear to be unauthorized individuals in the area. Warren grabbed the radio. What kind of individuals? Two men with rifles. Looks like they're tracking something, possibly Atlas. Despite the protected status granted to Atlas, the research team had been concerned about potential threats. Not everyone appreciated the story of the miracle wolf. Some local hunters viewed any predator as competition or danger, regardless of legal protections. Alert wildlife enforcement immediately, Warren instructed. Do not approach the hunters. Keep visual contact with Atlas if possible, but at a safe distance. He turned to Eleanor, his expression grave. We need to get out there. The specially equipped van transported them to the northern boundary of the study area, where they met Mike Henderson, who had responded to the alert from his nearby property. The field researchers had maintained visual contact with the hunters from a concealed position. Two men, not local from the looks of their gear, the graduate student reported. They've been following Atlas's tracks for at least an hour. He's aware of them, keeping his distance but not fleeing the area entirely. Trophy hunters, Mike growled. Heard rumors at the general store about some out-of-staters looking to bag the famous wolf. Didn't think they'd actually try it with all the publicity and protected status. Wildlife officers are 20 minutes out, Warren said, checking his phone. We need to keep those men from getting a clear shot at Atlas until then. Eleanor's face had gone pale. How? We can't put ourselves between armed men and their target. Warren considered their options, his scientific mind rapidly assessing variables. Atlas responds to familiar voices. He might come to us if called, removing him from their tracking path. Or we could confront them directly, Mike suggested. Let them know they're trespassing on monitored research grounds. Warren shook his head. Too risky if they're determined. Eleanor, you and I will try to call Atlas to the research blind at marker 7. Mike, you circle around to the access road where they likely parked. Get their vehicle information for the authorities. As Mike headed off on his assignment, Warren turned to Eleanor. Atlas knows your voice too. From before. From Sarah. She nodded, understanding the implication. Despite everything, she remained part of the family unit Atlas recognized. They positioned themselves in the research blind, a small, camouflaged shelter used for wildlife observation. Through binoculars, they could see Atlas moving cautiously through the trees about 400 yards away, occasionally glancing back toward where the hunters followed his trail. Warren opened the blind's small window and called out, not loudly, but with the distinctive whistle and call combination he had used during Atlas's rehabilitation 7 years earlier. Beside him, Eleanor added her own voice, speaking Sarah's nickname for the wolf, Atlas the Brave. The effect was immediate. The wolf's head snapped up, ears pivoting toward the sound. He stood motionless for several long seconds, seeming to process the familiar voices from his past. Then, with decisive purpose, he changed direction, not coming directly toward the blind, but taking a circuitous route that would bring him to Warren and Eleanor while breaking his trail for the hunters. He remembers the call, Eleanor whispered, astonished despite all they had already witnessed of Atlas's memory. He remembers everything, Warren replied simply. They watched as Atlas made his way toward them, moving with the silent efficiency that made wolves such effective predators. The hunters, meanwhile, had lost his trail and were casting about in growing frustration, unaware that their quarry had responded to human allies. Within minutes, Atlas appeared at the edge of the small clearing where the blind was situated. He approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as he confirmed the scents of Warren and Eleanor. When he reached the blind, he sat directly before it, yellow eyes fixed on the small window where their faces were visible. Good boy, Warren said softly. Smart boy. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the tableau. This wild, intelligent creature who had saved her husband now sitting before them like a sentinel, trust evident in every line of his powerful body. And in that moment, something shifted in Eleanor's understanding. The weight of her guilt, which had been her constant companion for months, didn't disappear, but it transformed. If this wolf could remember both injury and healing, could choose connection over fear, perhaps there was a path forward for her as well, not erasing the past, but building something new alongside it. Warren, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I want to come home. Not because it's convenient or expected, but because I want to try to rebuild whatever can be rebuilt between us. Warren's eyes didn't leave Atlas as he replied, It won't be easy. Trust once broken. I know, she acknowledged, but Atlas found a way back to you after 7 years. He remembered both the wound and the healing. Maybe we can learn to hold both truths, too. Before Warren could respond, the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching interrupted them. Wildlife enforcement officers had arrived, their trucks blocking the access road where the hunters had parked. Mike Henderson's voice came through the radio, confirming that the hunters were being detained for questioning. Atlas, hearing the commotion, rose to his feet but didn't flee. Instead, he moved closer to the blind, positioning himself between the distant confrontation and the two humans inside, a protective stance that spoke volumes about his perception of their relationship. Warren reached through the window, his hand hovering just above Atlas's head, not quite touching, respecting the boundary between wild and tame. The wolf looked up, meeting his eyes with that uncanny intelligence. Thank you, Warren said simply. Whether the words were meant for Atlas or Eleanor, or perhaps both, remained beautifully, purposefully ambiguous. 2 days later, Warren Mitchell moved back into the modified cabin that had been his home for 40 years. A wheelchair ramp now graced the front entrance. The bathroom had been renovated for accessibility. Doorways had been widened, counters lowered, and Eleanor Mitchell came with him, stepping tentatively into a future neither of them could have imagined months earlier. Their relationship existed in an undefined space, not the comfortable partnership of their earlier decades, not the strained caretaker-patient dynamic of the pre-abandonment period, but something new and still forming. That first evening, as sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they sat on the widened porch, Warren in his wheelchair, Eleanor in the old rocker that had been Sarah's favorite. Between them rested Warren's research journal, open to a fresh page where he had begun documenting the day's observations. At the edge of the cleared area around the cabin, Atlas appeared right on schedule. The wolf had expanded his territorial patrol to include their home, appearing each evening as if checking that all was well before continuing his rounds. He's integrating us back into his understanding of normal, Warren noted, making an entry in the journal, adjusting his mental map to include the cabin again. Will he ever trust me? Eleanor asked quietly, watching the wolf's careful assessment of their position. Warren considered this. I don't think trust is the right framework. Atlas doesn't think in human terms of betrayal and forgiveness. He observes patterns, adapts to changes, makes decisions based on current conditions rather than past grievances. That sounds like a healthier approach than most humans manage, Eleanor observed. We could learn from it, Warren agreed. Not to forget the past, but to prevent it from dictating the future. As darkness settled over the mountains, Atlas completed his inspection and melted back into the forest. Warren and Eleanor remained on the porch, the silence between them no longer filled with unspoken accusations, but with the possibility of something neither had anticipated, a second chance, unexpected and undeserved, yet undeniably present. Like the wolf who had made it possible, This new beginning was both wild and deliberate, both fragile and resilient, a daily choice to remember everything and still move forward, one careful step at a time. 1 year after Eleanor Mitchell had abandoned her husband in the wilderness, the story of Warren, Eleanor, and Atlas had transformed from national scandal to something approaching legend in western Montana. The research project documenting Atlas's extraordinary cognitive abilities and interspecies bonds had gained international attention, with preliminary findings published in both scientific journals and popular media. On this crisp autumn morning, Warren sat in his modified pickup truck, specially equipped to accommodate his wheelchair, watching as a film crew set up equipment at the edge of the clearing. National Geographic had commissioned a documentary about Atlas, focusing on the remarkable relationship between the wolf and the humans whose lives he had changed. "You sure you're comfortable with this?" Mike Henderson asked, leaning against the truck's open door. "Once this airs, you'll never be rid of the attention." Warren nodded, his gaze fixed on the tree line where Atlas typically appeared during their morning observation sessions. "The story matters, Mike, not just for us, but for what it teaches about connection, about possibilities we've overlooked." In the year since returning home, Warren's recovery had continued to surprise his doctors. While he would never regain full function on his right side, consistent therapy had restored enough mobility for him to transfer independently from wheelchair to bed, to dress himself with adaptive equipment, and even to handle much of his personal care. His speech had improved dramatically, though he still spoke with deliberate care when tired. More remarkable than his physical recovery was the gradual rebuilding of his relationship with Eleanor. They existed in a space that defied simple categorization, not quite husband and wife in the traditional sense, yet bound by something deeper than mere partnership. They shared the cabin, their work, their daily routines. They did not share a bedroom. That intimacy remained a bridge too far, perhaps permanently. What they did share was purpose. The Atlas Project, as it had come to be known, provided structure and meaning that transcended their personal history. Eleanor had evolved from reluctant participant to essential team member, her organizational skills and historical knowledge of Atlas proving invaluable as the research expanded. "The director wants to interview you both together," Mike mentioned. "About that day in the forest. You okay with revisiting that?" Warren's expression remained composed. "It's not about revisiting, Mike. It's about context. People need to understand this isn't just a feel-good animal story. It's about failure, systematic and personal, and what comes after." As they spoke, Eleanor emerged from the cabin carrying a thermos and Warren's medication. She had aged visibly over the past year, her once auburn hair now almost completely gray, lines etched more deeply around her eyes and mouth. The weight of what she had done remained evident in her careful movements, in the way she always seemed slightly hesitant in Warren's presence, as if perpetually awaiting judgment. "Your 10 o'clock pills," she said, handing him the small container and thermos. "And coffee." "Thank you," Warren replied, their fingers briefly touching during the exchange. A small moment of normalized connection that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Eleanor glanced toward the film crew. "They want to start with Atlas footage, then our interviews after lunch. Dr. Abrams just called. She's running about 30 minutes late." Warren nodded, taking his medication with practiced efficiency. "Has Atlas been spotted this morning?" "Camera trap caught him at the East Ridge about an hour ago," Eleanor replied. "Moving this direction." Their conversation, practical and focused on the present, illustrated the careful equilibrium they had established. They spoke of Atlas, of the research, of daily logistics. They rarely spoke directly of the past, though its presence informed every interaction, every careful courtesy between them. "I'll go help the crew set up the observation blind," Eleanor said, already turning toward the activity at the clearing's edge. Warren watched her go, his expression thoughtful. "She still can't forgive herself," he observed quietly to Mike, "even though I've told her I don't hold it against her anymore." Mike settled his weathered frame against the truck. "Some things a person has to work out with themselves, Warren. No one else can do it for them." "Like you and your father?" Warren asked, referencing the story Mike had shared with Eleanor months earlier about saving his father despite orders to leave him, only to face years of resentment afterward. Mike nodded. "Some men can't accept being saved. Eleanor can't accept being forgiven. Two sides of the same coin." Their conversation paused as movement at the forest edge caught their attention. Atlas had appeared, his silver-gray coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. The wolf stood at his usual observation point, yellow eyes taking in the unusual activity in the clearing, the film crew, the equipment, the strangers. The director noticed, gesturing excitedly to her cameraman. Get this, that's him, right?" Warren lifted a hand in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement toward Atlas. The wolf remained still, assessing the situation with characteristic intelligence. After several moments of observation, he turned and melted back into the forest, not fleeing but retreating to a more comfortable distance. "He'll circle around," Warren explained to the disappointed director who approached his truck. "Come back when he's assessed the threat level. Atlas doesn't perform on cue. That's rather the point of our research." The director, a woman named Catherine Reynolds with an impressive portfolio of wildlife documentaries, nodded her understanding. "That's what makes this story so compelling, Dr. Mitchell. This isn't about a tame wolf or a pet. This is about a wild animal making choices that defy our understanding of wildlife behavior." "Not defy," Warren corrected gently. "Expand. Atlas isn't doing anything impossible. He's demonstrating capabilities that exist in his species but that we've failed to recognize or document." As the morning progressed, Atlas did indeed return, establishing a watchful presence at varying distances from the human activity. The film crew captured remarkable footage of his behavior, his attentive observation, his careful movement, his clear recognition of and differential response to Warren, Eleanor, and Mike compared to the strangers. After lunch, the time came for the interviews. The crew set up on the cabin's wide porch, positioning Warren and Eleanor side by side with the forest as backdrop. Atlas had withdrawn again, but his periodic appearances at the tree line served as a powerful visual counterpoint to the human narrative being recorded. "Let's start at the beginning," Catherine suggested, settling into her role as interviewer. "Warren, can you tell us about your first encounter with Atlas 7 years ago?" Warren recounted the story of finding the injured wolf cub, the illegal trap that had nearly severed its leg, and the 3 weeks of rehabilitation in their shed with Sarah's help. As he spoke, Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on her hands, the mention of their daughter still a source of shared pain. "And Eleanor, you were part of that initial rescue as well?" Catherine prompted. "Peripherally," Eleanor replied. "I was working full-time as a nurse then. Sarah and Warren handled most of the actual care. She paused, a memory surfacing. "I remember bringing them sandwiches in the shed. Sarah was so excited, talking about how Atlas watched their faces, not just their hands. 'He's trying to understand us, Mom,' she said. And then Sarah died," Catherine said gently, "the day after Atlas was released." Warren nodded, his expression composed but somber. "Car accident. Icy roads. That must have been devastating for both of you." "It was the beginning of the end for us," Eleanor said quietly, the words emerging before she could censor them. "We grieved differently, separately. And then when Warren had his stroke," Catherine guided them through the progression, the stroke, the financial collapse, the burden of care that had ultimately led to Eleanor's desperate decision. Throughout the narrative, She maintained a remarkably balanced approach, neither excusing Eleanor's actions nor demonizing her. "What went through your mind," she asked Eleanor, "when you drove away that day?" Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, the question striking at the heart of her shame. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Relief," she admitted. "God help me, the first feeling was relief. Like putting down a weight I'd carried until my spine was about to snap. Then numbness. I think I was in shock at what I'd done. The guilt came later, crushing, absolute. But in that moment, driving away, I felt free." Her candor hung in the air between them. Warren reached across the space separating their chairs and placed his hand atop hers, a gesture caught perfectly by the cameras, though neither Mitchell was performing for the lens. "I understand that feeling," Warren said simply. The interview continued, covering Warren's survival with Atlas's help, the search and discovery, the legal proceedings, and the remarkable year of research that had followed. Throughout, Catherine maintained focus on the central miracle of their story, not just Warren's survival, but the extraordinary connection between human and wolf that had made it possible. Dr. Abrams has suggested that Atlas's behavior represents a form of interspecies empathy that challenges our understanding of animal cognition, Catherine noted. Do you agree with that assessment, Dr. Mitchell? Warren considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I believe Atlas demonstrates that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness are more permeable than we've acknowledged. He forms attachments, remembers past interactions, makes decisions based on complex associations. Is that empathy, perhaps? Or perhaps it's something equally profound that we lack language to properly describe." "And what about forgiveness?" Catherine asked, directing the question to both Mitchells. "Atlas seemed to forgive humans despite being injured by a human trap. Warren, you've chosen a path of reconciliation rather than punishment for Eleanor. Is there a parallel there?" A subtle tension rippled through Eleanor's posture at the direct question. Warren, sensing her discomfort, answered carefully. "I'm not sure forgiveness is the right framework," he said, "for Atlas or for us. What I've observed is something more nuanced, an ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. Atlas can remember both injury and healing. He can be both wild and connected. Similarly, humans can acknowledge terrible breaches without being forever defined by them." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Eleanor did something unforgivable, and yet here we are finding a way forward. Both statements are true. Atlas helps me understand how that's possible. As the interview concluded, Catherine asked a final question. "What's next for you both? For the research project? For Atlas?" Warren and Eleanor exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication passing between them. "The research continues," Warren replied. "We've secured funding for another 2 years of observation. We're expanding to include genetic testing of local wolf populations to determine if Atlas's cognitive capabilities might be hereditary or more widespread than previously recognized." "And for you personally?" Catherine pressed gently. Eleanor answered this time, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "We take each day as it comes. We work, we observe, we learn. From Atlas, from each other, from what we've been through. Some days are harder than others. Some wounds may never fully heal, but we're finding a way to move forward without denying the past." As the film crew packed up their equipment, Warren and Eleanor remained on the porch, watching the afternoon light filter through the pines. Atlas had reappeared at the forest edge, observing the departure of the strangers with evident interest. "You did well today," Warren said quietly. "Honest answers." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the wolf. "It still feels wrong, sometimes." building something new on the foundation of what I did to you. That's not what we're doing, Warren countered. We're building something new alongside what happened. The past doesn't go away, Eleanor. It just becomes part of a larger context. As if understanding the significance of their conversation, Atlas emerged fully from the tree line, approaching the cabin with deliberate strides. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at them with those intelligent yellow eyes. "He's never come this close to the cabin before," Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to move. Warren leaned forward in his wheelchair, studying the wolf with professional interest, layered over personal connection. "He's making a statement, establishing a new boundary." Atlas sat on his haunches, his posture almost formal as he regarded the two humans. In that moment, the wolf seemed to embody everything their year of research had documented, the impossible bridge between wild and tame, between instinct and choice, between past and present. "Hello, Atlas," Warren said softly. "Thank you for visiting." The wolf's ears twitched at Warren's voice, his head tilting slightly in that characteristic gesture of attention. For several minutes he remained at the foot of the steps, engaged in silent communion with the humans who had become so inexplicably central to his existence. Then, with the same deliberate grace that characterized all his movements, Atlas rose, turned, and trotted back toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused, looking back once, not at Warren specifically, but at both Mitchells, as if fixing their image in his remarkable memory. "He sees us together," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "As a unit." Warren nodded, understanding the significance of her observation. "Yes. Despite everything, he still recognizes the connection between us." As Atlas disappeared into the gathering dusk, Warren and Eleanor remained on the porch, the silence between them no longer heavy with unspoken recrimination, but softened by the shared witness of something that transcended their human capacity to categorize or explain. In the year since Warren had returned home, they had established new patterns, new boundaries, new ways of coexisting in the aftermath of profound betrayal. They were not who they had been before, neither the devoted couple of their early years, nor the caregiver and patient of their darkest times. Instead, they had become something else entirely, two people bound by history, by shared purpose, and by the miraculous intervention of a creature who had somehow recognized the possibility of renewal when they themselves could not. "I'm going to start dinner," Eleanor said, finally, rising from her chair. "I'll help," Warren replied, maneuvering his wheelchair toward the door she held open. This simple exchange, ordinary, domestic, unremarkable, represented perhaps the most profound miracle of all, the quiet determination to continue, to find meaning, to build something worth preserving from the shattered pieces of what had been lost. As they moved into the warmth of the cabin together, the first stars appeared above the Montana wilderness where Atlas roamed, constant, watchful, and somehow, against all scientific expectation, connected to the humans whose lives he had forever changed. Not through forgiveness, as humans understood it, but through something perhaps more profound, the recognition that life continues, that bonds endure, and that even the deepest wounds can become part of a larger story of healing if we are brave enough to allow it. When life has weathered your body and spirit, remember Warren and Eleanor's journey. Their story isn't just about survival or betrayal, it's about finding grace in our broken places. Many of us face our own wilderness, health crises, financial collapse, caregiver burnout, or the unbearable weight of impossible choices. Yet like Atlas emerging from the forest, second chances can appear from unexpected sources. Warren's words resonate deeply. The past doesn't go away. It just becomes part of a larger context. This is wisdom for our season of life. We're not defined solely by our mistakes or triumphs, but by our willingness to build something new alongside our scars. Whether you're facing health challenges, relationship fractures, or the loneliness that sometimes accompanies aging, remember that healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about creating meaning from it. What wilderness are you facing today, and where might your unexpected atlas be waiting to guide you toward renewal? Share your story of second chances in the comments below. We find strength in knowing we aren't alone in our struggles or our hope for redemption.